Thank you. First of all, I just want to give you kind of a roadmap to this talk. I'm going to speak mainly first in ecology because that's where I spend my time, how my brain thinks. And I'm going to show you some of the pathologies with ecology that are a metaphor, I believe, to health, and then connect it to what I see are some of the frontiers with regards to ecological health, and then some of the institutional issues in terms of how we can apply those issues in society. First of all, I do touch animals. I have been known to touch animals in different parts of the world. I know some of you in this audience have touched animals. And when you touch animals, you know about their habitat. And as you know, in the last 500 and so years, things have changed on this planet with regards to habitat. And this is Manhattan pre-settlement, and this is Manhattan today. You're moving to Manhattan, is that right?
Who took that top picture?
Eric Sanderson. And of course, this is Manhattan in the future. So it's going to sink under its own weight. We know why. But if anyone was to look at the change of the globe, I mean, the urbanization of the world is striking. Talk about major land transformation around the world. More people now in the United States live in urban environments. Certainly most people around the world live in urban environments. Wild wilderness areas, this was just released 3 days ago. This is the human footprint map of Canada, so you can't get it fresher than this. And you can see how the influence of people and settlement and energy development are transforming even southern part of Canada.
Is that your corridor right there?
Yeah, exactly. Well, this is Yellowstone to Yukon. Exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, everyone has this thing, you go up into Canada and it's wild. No, most Canadians live within 50 miles of the US border, and it's very densely impacted. And so we're moving towards what I call the Borg planet. Anyone from Star Trek generation, we're totally transforming the Earth in many ways. And this paper is what keeps me up at night. This is Tony Barnofsky and his wife Elizabeth Hardy at UC Berkeley. They did a review in Nature. We're essentially approaching the whole human impact on the Earth, human-generated impact. We're transforming the ecological framework of our planet. We're in a state shift. And that keeps me up because that's fundamental to all life, not just human life on this planet. And in parallel to folks looking at these kind of planetary health issues, there's been a group out of Stockholm led by Rockström. And I adapted one of their papers. You may know it as a circle, but I kind of see it as a vice. Because in some ways, a lot of these ecological issues, environmental issues, are impinging on the operating space for humanity and nature. And at the same time, we have things inherent in human societies that determine or deterministic about human behavior. And between the two, because sometimes when you're in this world of ecology and society, you're in this thing of people versus the environment. And in many ways, it's a vice. They're two edges of the same issue that's diminishing the operating space for humanity and nature. This is the ultimate challenge we have going forward as a society, is how to maintain that space larger through our practice. Well, fragmentation, as we lose the habitat, fragmentation continues, and everything we know about conservation science is true. After fragmentation, 25 years of monitoring forests in tropical forests in Latin America, yes, we're seeing that species go extinct. And in North America, we've seen the range contractions of 17 largest species in North America, from grizzly bears to wolves to pronghorn. Total range contraction as we're transforming the landscape. And I find the kind of the icon of this whole transformation is the grizzly bear, the brown bear. California Republic, this is their symbol. The UCLA Bruins, the Cal Bears. California State Parks, they have a bear, an extinct or extirpated species on their shoulder. This is the last grizzly bear in California, 1922 shot. And we've seen this kind of winking out, this extinction process of bears moving northward. And even just this past week, there was a paper that came out that, the world's carnivores, large carnivores, are a threat, but they have an important ecological role as top-down regulators. in terms of how they manage other species in the food chain and how those species in the food chain affect the trophic structure below them. And so, it's not just a charismatic species issue here with these large carnivores. They have ecological roles. So again, I was going to tell you how this is a metaphor for how we look at this problem, and then I'm going to apply it to health in a bit. So everyone says think out of the box, right? Well, the 1872 solution for conservation with this idea of fragmentation was a box. In fact, it was Yellowstone National Park, and it truly is a box. And that is how our kind of approach is a very linear two-dimensional approach to a problem. And when you think like a box, you manage the landscape like a box. Now, you could be in management, you can be in health, you could be in any kind of discipline, but there's always these box thinking. And box thinking applied ecologically is where this is the boundary of Yellowstone National Park, and this is the national park with the trees, and this is the national forest without the trees. And that perversity of boxes can go even further. This is the checkerboard landscape as the railroads expanded west and were given private land interspersed with public land. And then you can see how we manage the ecology in a box-like fashion. And of course, that's not necessarily the way ecology works. Two brothers, twin brothers, Frank and John Craighead, were the first to put radio collars on grizzly bears again, and found out that grizzly bears did not stay within the box. And this led to the whole, concept of ecosystem, the polygon of what is the scale that you are going to conserve nature. And and is it at which scale? The ecosystem scale? Is it an ecoregional scale? Is it at a continental scale? Because what we're trying to do in conservation is conserve ecological processes that sustain nature. And so you want to conserve nature at the proper scale. And why? Because we're conserving processes. And processes include everything from fire ecology, hydrology, disease, dispersal, pollination. These are the functional elements of life on this planet. So if we're going to have a state shift on life on this planet, these are the things that we have to be concerned about in this state shift. Well, how much is enough when you're talking about scale? Because policymakers, if you look at this graph, these are all the UN kind of reports, starting with the Brundtland report, which said, well, the amount of nature we need to save on this planet is 12%. So they wanted to maximize the least. And they've always seen that protecting nature of this 12% rule was a ceiling to conservation. Well, if you look at the scientific community and ask them how much is enough, some of them migrate more than 50% of the landscape needs to be protected to maintain the ecological processes that are sustained on this planet. And so one thought of these arbitrary numbers as a ceiling, and others thought of it as a floor. And this is the difference between scientists and policymakers with regards to how much nature is necessary to maintain ecological function. Now, another aspect of scale is that, okay, well, nature works at one scale, but the way we as people organize ourselves is at another scale. And this is a challenge because there is a disconnect between essentially our ability to work at a large scale based on whatever kind of governance structure, our cultures, the way we interact with our species. This is our great challenge. So a response has come to try to link nature and people, and that's large landscape conservation. And that's what I've been trying to foster for the last 10 years. And when I mean large landscape, it's a general term. You kind of think of it as t-shirt size in terms of scale. There's, for some people it's about 100,000 acres, like a ranch, and some people it's like 100 million acres, like Yellowstone to Yukon, or the Canadian Boreal. And it's a relative. It is scale, it's contextual. But it is kind of a concept of thinking beyond the scale that you feel comfortable with, and at a scale that makes a difference in terms of some of these global processes. Jonathan told you about my work with Yellowstone to Yukon. About 20 years ago, a group of Canadians and Americans got together and said, we have to start conserving nature at a scale that nature works. And it was an iconic landscape with Yellowstone National Park, Banff National Park, the first World Heritage site in Canada. And over time, we've been able to preserve about 29 million acres, just because we were thinking at a larger scale. because when we changed our thought, changed our horizon, then the art of possibility became greater. And this has led to many other efforts, growing out of this. There's now a big effort in the Great Plains. There's an effort to protect the rainforests of British Columbia, the whole Canadian Boreal Initiative. And this isn't just landscapes. This is, the boreal forests are key to the functioning of the hydrosystem of our planet. I mean, it is, this is not just protecting land for land's sake. This is an important planetary function that the boreal forests play. And it's grown, this whole large landscape perspective. Once the art of possibility has come in, other regions have taken this on. This is in New England, where it's been chopped over several times. Yet within that, people are starting to realize that there are larger landscape efforts that need to happen, and they're starting to link up in networks in New England, and they're starting to link up around the West, and they're happening globally, whether it's to protect the watershed of Eastern Australia, all these forests that are very important for a country dominated by climate change, or whether it's the first wolf that has migrated from the Alps to northern Spain because of essentially the land transformation, the regrowth of vegetation in Europe. And it's not all about ecology, some of these large landscape things. Some are about just economic sustainability. They're not there. They're about how to maintain human communities as well as the natural resource base that support those communities. And they're governed in very different ways. Some are have formal structures like the Tahoe Regional Authority around Lake Tahoe. Some are networks, loose networks that have some kind of connective tissue that supports collaboration. But what they all share is that the larger the scale you have, the more ecological function you can maintain, but the management control is less. So you have this disconnect between the scale of the ecology and how people organize themselves. Now, one area that I was able to get University of Montana involved in is around the crown of the continent, which is the area, the ecosystem that surrounds the Glacier and Waterton International Peace Park, the first peace park in the world. And why this is interesting is because the University of Montana, land-grant university, actually Montana has two, 1893, two universities started, is that the identity of the university is based on its identity in the landscape it is nested. In fact, half the students from outside the state come to the University of Montana because of the identity with the landscape. And as a land-grant institution, many universities are good with the research and education part of the stool, but not with the social component, societal benefit. And so the University of Montana, as part of trying to build up the societal benefit, is trying to figure out how to engage this large landscape, diverse community, 5 different tribes, some resource-dependent communities, big tourism area, but it is the landscape that sustains the university, and it sees it interdependent in what it does. And from a continental scale, it's a place where 3 continental basins connect, the Atlantic, Pacific, and Hudson Bay. Well, and that's very interesting, except when you know that most of the glaciers that sustain the hydrology in the area are disappearing. In fact, Glacier National Park will be known as former Glacier National Park in the next 25 years. We will lose all its glaciers. They've been around for about 7,000 years, and 25 of them are remaining, and it's projected in 20 years they will be gone. And so, have you seen me? Lost glacier. And so what the University of Montana has done is create a roundtable. So how do you link up these kind of stakeholders in this large landscape? Well, you got to bring them to the table. So they brought the First Nations, community leaders, small businesses, resource industries, researchers, educationists, conservationists, landowners, everyone that has a stake in this landscape as it's undergoing climate change. Because this is what's going to take. It's going to take the diversity of these communities together to address a large-scale problem like climate change and climate adaptation. And not only is this kind of round table a project embedded in an ecosystem, it kind of connects to other scales of activity in that region. So it's nested within other type of large landscape work in the region, and it's vertically nested within other kind of large-scale efforts. So there are efforts going on at what's called the Great Northern LCC region, and then the Crown of the Continent fits right in that, and then fits within national policy. And so what you're doing is you're nesting these efforts not only horizontally on a landscape, but vertically through the policy process. And then you build up into a practitioner's network, and you create a network of all these large landscapes. There are about 500 of them in North America, and you build a community of practice and for climate adaptation based on a large landscape theme. Health fits within this. Now, we know what's coming with the future here, and maybe if you've seen this slide, but the great one, Wayne Gretzky said, some people skate to the puck, I skate to where the puck's going to be. And that's how we have to look at some of these issues. That's why this large landscape approach is, and bringing stakeholders at a social scale to address it matters, because we have to work at a scale bigger than we've done before. And so the hockey stick here, as we all know, is this. And so the Western Governors Association took this to heart, and this is their actual logo. And I pointed out to them that this is very interesting. The sea levels are rising, it's getting warmer outside, the glaciers are melting, and all your forests are on fire. And they're getting it. They're seeing the future. So the joke is that what do Sarah Palin, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Bill Richardson, and Janet Napolitano all agree upon? They were all governors that agreed to a framework to work at a larger scale beyond their states to address an issue relating to animal-wildlife movement. Because in a climate-changing world, animals are going to respond to the changing environmental conditions, and they created a policy framework for this. And some of you may know about some of these minor fixes here. Infrastructure development is one of the biggest threats. We started with the urbanization of the world. A lot of it through Chinese money. You're in Africa, you're in Asia. Infrastructure development is becoming a huge fragmentation issue around the world. And what are the fixes to this? One of those is road crossings or highway overpasses. And it seems really kind of a simple solution to a major fragmentation process, but they do work. And I just thought that, because roads and highway represent 20% of landscapes of the built environment, and yet, we don't even consider them in an ecological sense. We don't even consider them from a health sense in terms of road collisions. Everyone's so focused on bike paths and isn't it great? These are really, there's more to roads than just getting people next to them. They have an ecological function that has not really been addressed, and there's something we can do. It's an open field.
So we, in Wisconsin, we know about this hazard.
Exactly.
Deer and cars.
And I think it's funny, and it's just on a humorous side, there's road rage here, but if you have the animals crossing, and they do work. In Banff National Park, they didn't think these would work. They're about 50 meters across. And female grizzly bears are probably the least, they're the most sensitive to this kind of contact with human-dominated landscapes because of the noise and dust and lights from cars. But it actually does work. And 600 different bears have used this one crossing in Banff National Park. And sometimes you can get road rage of a different sort. And the ends around the world. This is Christmas Island, Australian territory, for the Christmas. We have to think of infrastructure not only as green buildings, but infrastructure in terms of how it adds to or detracts from the ecological value of landscapes.
I hope there's not a pot of boiling water on the other side of it.
So what I've been building up to in all this is that, historically we've been looking at, conservation in terms of parks and protected areas and, these defined ecological zoos. But in reality, when we're dealing with planetary health, we have to think of it as whole system conservation. All land has a conservation value. All land has some kind of ecological protection. And it isn't just something we put aside elsewhere. And it's that urban environments have ecological functions, as do rural environments, as do wildland environments. And this is the kind of it's a holistic approach, if you will. A lot of you know John Foley at University of Minnesota, who used to be here. I mean, his work just demonstrates how agriculture needs to transform itself from being focused on essentially, one bundle of outputs, when really agricultural lands can give you a multitude of benefits. And we haven't even changed the way, how we grow food. It's more than just food, it's other ecological benefits. In health, you would call it, Jonathan, as co-benefits. Well, this is co-benefits in terms of landscapes. And no more this divide between the urban environment and the wildland environment. Right now, all of this has to be more integrated and more synthetically addressed. So 50 years ago, this year, two major events kind of defined, I would say, social and conservation action within the United States. The Civil Rights Act and the Wilderness Act. And yet we work as if these two things, remember the vice I showed you, of the human threats and the environmental issues? Well, these came out parallel about 50 years ago, and I believe this still holds true, that they're on parallel tracks, and now it's time that we bring these two together. Because civil rights is how we maintain and live on this landscape in a way that's mutually supportive. And many of the institutions that you know of, conservation organizations, even the way some universities have been designed, university centers, come from a mindset of the early 1970s. Yet they really haven't evolved as some of these situations and the complexity of these problems have evolved. So again, Wayne Gretzky. So where is this all leading to? Where are we going to be? Well, where the societal puck's going to be, and this is important in terms of how you might design something in the health sector, is that we're moving from a disposable to a sustainable society. We're moving from secret to a transparent society. From competition to collaboration, from the individual to community, from top down to bottom up, from vertical to horizontal kind of organizational structures, from single disciplinary to interdisciplinary, true interdisciplinary, elite knowledge to shared knowledge, and small scale to large scale. This is the wave that's happening now. This is Edward Snowden. I mean, it really is in terms of what you're seeing here, in terms of how this affects institutions and societal intercourse, societal discourse. And you can already see the governmental response now to do more with less. It's not just here, it's happening all around the world. And government 2020, the perpetual collaboration mandate. In order to achieve our missions, whether it's our health mission or ecology mission, it's going to have to be through some kind of collaboration. So the future isn't going to be a UN-style approach to dealing with these problems. I just think that, we might have the World Trade Organization. I don't think that's going to work. I think it's going to be a bottom-up effect that's networked through network communication, through network science, through network governance, and through a network society. And these are the future values of an institution. Because at Stanford Social Innovation Review, Connie and Kramer say, large-scale social change requires broad cross-sector coordination, yet the social sector remains focused on isolated intervention of individual organizations. So the time of the ivory tower approach of one organization is perhaps not going to work in a new reality of planetary health. This gets into conservation medicine. I was recruited by Tufts Vet School to come up with a new kind of ecological health paradigm that brought together veterinarians, ecologists, physicians, public health people. And we prototyped this in 1996. And certainly there's been a lot of things that have evolved out of this, One Health being one of the sectors that has evolved out of this. But basically is that the foundations of life on our planet are tied to the ecology of our planet. And here were some of the things that we thought about in terms of the frontiers of the field, in terms of ecological health practice, is that really no one's looking at the anthropogenic effects of ecology and disease processes. You know, whether it's climate change, ecoimmunology, cumulative impacts from the toxic world to the ecology, to land use, the stress effect on species and systems. These are pretty much not covered within the health agenda. The beneficial role of parasites and pathogens. It's not always bad. Of the world, whether it's illegal wildlife trade, wasn't really focused on, and now trophic cascade interventions. But we haven't looked at the whole food chain, how these things have feedback loops with each other. Like here with the interaction between rinderpest and wildebeest and grass growing and carbon, the rinderpest wildebeest issue. But we don't really think about how it affects all these other factors in terms of that. We've seen a lot of health practices that have had unintended consequences of the vector for emerging diseases. Yep, but they're portrayed in such a negative social light, you wouldn't know that the key pollinator of all the forests, and get rid of the key pollinator. You get rid of the key pollinator, you've narrowed the issue so myopically. And then we have things like test and slaughter and eradicate issue. And the literature is a replete problem for another. And that's where the health and the ecology sector have to work on the understanding of these of this chasm. Life will find a way. If there's life breaks free, it expands to new territories, and there it is. And let's look at smallpox, the touchstone for all our. And it turns out that monkeypox, maybe this is how it is. We just fight, or how we vaccinate species. You know, for instance, there's been near the Serengeti, and yes, we've helped a certain population in competition with cheetahs. So, you know, what are the barriers to the uptakes of this ecological research into practice? Well, much of disease is focused on infectious diseases and not on other interrelated health issues. There's a very anthropocentric value of health, so public health model does not include ecology. Intervention overwhelmingly focuses on proximal cause of disease, and issues are viewed separately. They're not in the mainstream. And there's a lot of those causation models within this field in terms of how you might. Today's ecological health practice, well, much of the research is focused on a lot of research. And I'm going to just take a jab at the IPCC. I mean, I'm sorry, I know it's Jonathan, something near and dear to your heart, but we're getting to the fifth assessment. So how many authors have we gotten? We're getting more and more authors. We're getting more and more resolution. Our certainty factor is growing stronger and stronger. The amount of carbon dioxide in the environment increases. We're studying the problem to death. We know the problem. All that energy to defining the problem, and yet what we need as well is the solution. And this gets into, you know, the health realm. Are we this kind of paradigm in terms of health, or are we this kind of paradigm in terms of health? So what are the opportunities? Well, I think in terms of the crossover of ecological research and public health, rethinking traditional interventional practices towards an eye towards ecology. Rethinking traditional ecological concepts with a focus on health, so the other way around. New horizons for integrative health and ecological monitoring. And in a rise era of big data, there's an opportunity to be proactive versus reactive. And I think this is one thing that isn't taken advantage of as much in either the ecology or the medical or health communities. Practitioners as scientists, citizen science. I think if we engage the practitioners more as being part of the solution, they can be part of the camaraderie of community of folks who can make a change in the world. So the institutional issues. If you want to get organizations to collaborate, you have some challenges with institutions. One is that you know, organizations have a life of their own. They like to be fed. And sometimes they do that at the cost of achieving their mission. Collaboration, and I don't know if this happens in academia, where there's issues about power, control, and credit. The issue about broad buy-in, commitment from the very top. I mean, there's some great innovation at in the ranks of faculty, but does the top really care? Because they're so focused on feeding the organization, they can't see the innovation. Always people who are innovators or innovative are left hanging, and there's never really a definition of what's in it for me that gets people involved. You know, and then there are these extra institutional issues of collaboration. You know, building trust, You know, when you work outside of Wisconsin, University of Wisconsin, and you want to collaborate with another university or entity, well, there's that no man's land between organization, and we call it it's nobody's job. And that's a big deal, because sometimes these things work because of the synergy between organizations. And so that connective tissue requires time and money, folks working together. And you might want to think about developing a parallel organizational structure, accountability, and how you deal with donors. And let me just put this on the table. I have talked today to University of Wisconsin. You talked to Pete Hudson at the Center for Disease Dynamics at Penn State University. You talked to Lonnie King at Ohio State University. You talked to Henry Beenan, who used to be the president of Northwestern University. You talked to Katie Pelican at University of Minnesota. This One Health, this integrative way of looking at ecology and health, is something that's being talked on every campus. My God, isn't it not only great that you might want to do something within your own universities, but what would be the power of bringing all the Big Ten together who have this kind of approach? You could create, you know, an elite consortium like Johns Hopkins and University of Wisconsin and all these other institutions, where they have people who are kind of thought leaders on this field. Or you want to make a global consortium to bring this together. Or you want to make a practitioners network. There are millions of ways to bring people together to look at these institutional issues. Here's the challenge that we face in a democratic society. I took this from Joel Cohn. Is that we want to conserve this planet over time and scale, right? We want, you know, business works, you know, in terms of large time but very rapid scale, very rapid time scales. But the way we govern ourselves in democratic structures does not impinge or touch on these issues. And when you look at institutions that can do that, there's only a few. Yes, we could have the WTO, WHO, UN. I just don't think they're efficient. But universities, you know, besides religion and culture, are an enduring institutions and have a role that they haven't even realized in terms of looking at these long-term issues of health and environment, of even dealing with business across scales and jurisdictions. And I did have some time in philanthropy, and this is very North American centric. But when you look at the funding that supports this kind of ecology, most of how we fund things in North America is very regionalized. We don't have, you know, when he looks at scale, the Great Lakes think of themselves as Great Lakes. Greater Toronto area, the GTA, thinks of itself in this regard. You know, Montreal doesn't even think of itself as part of Quebec. It's, you know, the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem is seen as separate from anywhere else. The Pacific Northwest, which is why, you know, University of Washington is going to tap into more money from Microsoft than, you know, University of Wisconsin, is because the mindset of the Pacific Northwest. People think in this kind of mindset, this geography. Philanthropic border fence. It's funny. California will invest in Baja California, but won't really invest anywhere below the border fence the true border fence that we've created. So there is also an ecoregion in terms of how money flows. So when Jonathan said, well, we're going to create the Wisconsin you know, Global Health Initiative, I was thinking, well, if you call it Wisconsin, then you're just going to find people in Wisconsin who are interested in what you do. And yes, you may get grants from this, you know, the DC area and a few elsewhere. You kind of limit your universe if you really want to be a global program. So how do you address the way people think and your ambitions to be globally? Finally, the brand name, moving beyond the brand name and the research industrial complex. Conservation medicine, eco-health, one whole, holistic health, selfish paradigm of good. I mean, these are all terms. If you're One Health, maybe there's a community of practice of One Health and everyone can talk to each other. But on another hand, if you're One Health, then how can I tell you're One Health from and that person's One Health or that institution's One Health? How do you make it beyond the brand? How, you know, so much gets into the branding that the goal is never really fleshed out. And I leave it to you. Here's the end. You know, we have a 100-year health mission for the health of this planet. We have to save the ecological foundation of this planet. We have to change the inflection point of human population growth and consumption within that 100 years. We have to change the inflection point or have an inflection point for carbon dioxide in the next 100 years. And we have to develop a sustainable glide path for human endeavor, a sustainable planet. This is, in a simple nutshell, what we have to do at a planet level. And this is what we have to have. We have to have planet doctors, really people who are bringing the atmosphere and the health professionals and the ecologists and the policy scientists together. We need to think at this scale because now this blue planet is the patient that we're trying to address. And it's no longer can we work in our silos. Because the first word I learned in ecology was interdependence. And it's the last word I'm going to give you today. Because this is really, the same issue that I dealt with in 9th grade ecology. It's about developing an interdependent model to look at health and ecology. Thank you. A lot there.
Lots of food for thought. So we have a good amount of time for questions, and
You don't have to ask any questions.
No. We have a first question.
Jonathan, I'll start us out. Ujambo.
Ujambo. Habari yako. That's very sad. And now we can sing it together. Jambo. Jambo.
That was good talk. I appreciate it. And I have two questions. With the zebra picture in Nairobi National Park, and you talked about integrating that, when I hear integration, you're not obviously talking about integrating into Nairobi National Park, but the park into the urban area.
Well,
and it just, wasn't there a corridor plan there or implemented?
Well, there is yes. No, urban growth has completely subsumed much of the north and eastern boundary of Nairobi National Park to the point it's almost functionally disconnected from the Athi Plains, which are south, and it is an issue, and not that that's a solution. The solution, I mean, the thing is now we have to think about Nairobi Park and the growth of Nairobi as one. And you would think that's crazy until you hear about a group called Chicago Wilderness. Has anyone heard about Chicago Wilderness? I mean, Chicago Wilderness, I think, is a brilliant idea. It's like looking at the holistic landscape of Chicago and knitting it together and seeing how people live and interact in that landscape and rebuilding the landscape functions around Chicago. And that has spurred interest in Houston Wilderness, and there's a similar thing now in San Francisco, and so there's always been this I felt kind of weird divide between cities and rural areas because urban metabolism reaches out into these distant areas and grabs those resources, and and now we have to connect the metabolic processes of a city with those resources in a way that makes sense. You had another, is that?
I was just out there,
Yeah.
and I was working at Penny Meat Commission on the Athi Plains on the big ranch south of the park. And I just thought it was interesting. There is a small corridor where you see the integration of the baboons in the Tabor slum, the largest slum in Africa. So it's extraordinarily stark, and very, there's a lot of poaching going on still there. But